In November of 2024, we shared the first part of an oral history recorded by the National Scouting Museum with Green Bar Bill. This interview was recorded in April of 1992. As I mentioned before, one of our seasonal museum specialists, Daniel Orcutt, converted these collected oral histories from analog tapes to a digital format. Listening to these recordings is not only an amazing glimpse into the past of Scouting America, but also helps us to better understand and interpret some of the artifacts we have in the collection and on display. This week, we will hear Green Bar Bill tell us about his experiences at the first two World Jamborees, how he made the transition from pharmacist, a lifelong goal of his, to journalist and writer, and how a fateful elevator ride changed his life forever in this edition of Artifact of the Week. The first World Jamboree was a big deal for the Scouting movement, which was still very early in its existence. This celebration of the potential of youth brings Scouts from around the world together to experience their common humanity. For Bill Hillcourt, this first World Jamboree would start a string of events that would change Hillcourt's life plan.
In 1920, I had reached exactly the kind of leadership ability and the kind of advancement that was required in my troop for me to represent the troop at that jamboree. According to the Danish rules at the time, every troop in Denmark had to be represented there, and I was the representative of my troop. And that's where I met Baden-Powell for the first time. It was an indoor jamboree in the equivalent of a Madison Square Garden. A very large building where they put on a military display and a complete horse demonstration of every kind that you can imagine there. The boys who took part in the competitions stayed in all of the special rooms in that building, but all the rest of us who were not in the competition team were staying in Richmond Park. And one day out in camp there, Baden-Powell came visiting there, and I had been prepared for seeing him, so I had an autograph book that really looked prominent with an old parchment binding that I asked him to sign, which he did. That was the first signature I had of Baden-Powell. I had many later.
4 years later, as Hillcourt was finishing his schooling to become a pharmacist and the second World Jamboree was about to happen, Hillcourt arranged for his entire troop to attend the Jamboree, being hosted in his native country of Denmark. He also did something that even surprised himself.
But then we got to the second World Jamboree, and just before that, I got the dream fulfilled of becoming a Master of Science in Pharmacy. I made up my mind that was going to be my life work. To my surprise that it wasn't going to be, because I got bitten by a journalistic spree there. I had written 3 boys' books and a Danish Boy Scout Handbook, and I'd been at the Jamboree and I was going to another one, so I walked out into the office of a Copenhagen newspaper, the second largest, and said, I want to be your correspondent to the second Jamboree that's coming to Copenhagen. And I know all about Jamborees. I had been the only one that had ever existed, and I could write, which I had proved through the books that had published. So they took me in, and I got stuck as a journalist and eventually as the managing editor of the Sunday magazine of that particular newspaper. So I made out all right.
Following the second World Jamboree, Hillcourt figured out he had a skill, writing, that he could combine with his love for scouting, and embarked on a world tour with his first stop being in England.
And then the next year, I was getting rather, I started dreaming about big dreams, you know. I met these scouts from around the world at 2 jamborees, and I decided I wanted to meet them in their home territory. So I had a fantastic plan of, I wanted to become a a traveling journalist for my newspaper and travel around the world and writing articles for the paper, and then trying to find my way and earning a little extra money on the way to do the rest of the job, which I set out to do in 1925. I went to England first, and I wrote another book there, and that paid my fare to the United States. And I was greeted in the United States by a representative from the Boy Scouts of America, so I did not have to go to Ellis Island. And they took me in and got me settled, and had expressed a desire to go camping with the American Boy Scouts for that summer. And the person who had been the Scoutmaster of the American troop at Jamboree in Denmark managed to arrange for me to have 10 weeks of summer camp with the New York Boy Scouts.
Hillcourt spent the summer of 1925 at one of the scout camps on the banks of Lake Kanawaki, about 50 miles north of New York City.
That was up in a Bear Mountain area. There was a whole string of camps from different councils around the Lake Kanawaki in the Bear Mountain State Park. And there I learned all about Boy Scouting by acting it out every day of the 10 weeks, seeing how they marched into the dining halls and things like that, and the way they did nature study, nature hikes and so on, and made a nature museum, and I found out more about the American plants. Every time I wanted to find out the name of an American plant, all I had to do was to look up the Latin name in my little flora, and that gave the English name. And that's the way I learned all of the American plant lives, by going by way of Latin. And that's where I learned a lot of special skills. And that's where I learned a lot of about nature in the United States. There's a fellow there who was one of the trustees of the American Museum of Natural History. His name was Benny Hyde. He was a rather wealthy man who liked to spend the summer in camp and be in charge of some of the nature activities. Mm-hmm. And he took us on special trips, and I remember one time we went to a beaver pond late at night and saw the beavers swimming back and forth, and then of course it got dark. And then to our astonishment, by playing the flashlight on it, the beavers just continued to rest as long as we wanted to stay around to see the beavers working. And they were still working at it without being bothered by any flashlight. But there was another person I met there by the name of Bill Carr, and he was working under Benny Hyde. And eventually he became the one who developed the Sonora, Arizona Desert Museum that has become a very famous museum that's known all over the world. And he was one of my best friends, and he's the one who made me write my first article in English, because he was the editor of the weekly magazine that he brought out, describing all kinds of features of nature there.
Following his 10 weeks at summer camp, Hillcourt returned to New York City to learn more about how scouting was administered in the United States. Specifically, he wanted to learn how the supply division of the National Council worked. An accident and subsequent injury to Hillcourt again adjusted his course in ways he likely couldn't imagine at the time.
After that was over, I went back to New York, and the Danish Boy Scouts had asked me to find out about the supply part of the Boy Scout movement. How do you get your uniform? How do you get your equipment? How do you get your pots and your tents and things like that? So the same friend who had made arrangement for me to go to the camp of the Boy Scouts of New York got me into the supply division of the Boy Scouts. And I was given a very special job. I was only going to stay there for a limited length of time. So they decided, well, we'll give you 1 week in the reception department, 1 week in the shipping department, 1 week in accounting, 1 week in promotion, and so on, so that I could learn the whole thing from one end to the other. And one day I was in one of these departments. We had a shipment of sickle poles, semaphore sickle flagpoles from the First World War. And in the First World War, to communicate from one warship to another, you have to have somebody with a single, a long flagpole that you had to screw together and to which you had to attach one flag to be able to send the semaphore flag. That was the best way of seeing a signal in those days. And some of these big boxes weighing about 300 pounds and continue nothing but these had been shipped from one depot to another during the period between 1918, the end of the war, and my time in New York in 1926. So you can imagine that something could have happened to them. As a matter of fact, the boxes were in a rather poor condition there. So that's why one of them that had been stacked on end started wobbling over and caught me before it could get out of there. And after 4 days in the hospital, I was out on crutches, and I came back into the national office to pick up my mail because I didn't know what my address would be ordinarily. And one day, and this is where the big special thing of my life appeared, changed my life completely. I had picked up the mail and was standing at the elevator to go back to my little room. And you had to wait just as long as those days as one elevator as you had to do today. And the door opened and the Chief Scout Executive of the Boy Scouts came out. And we had a conversation, and I told him about my experiences and about my concerns about that, because I felt I hadn't seen real Boy Scouting in the United States. Well, he asked me a number of rather searching questions, and then of course the elevator came, and we went down and disappeared in 2 different directions. But I had the feeling that he had been particularly interested in what I had said. So I sat down and I wrote an 18-page single-spaced memorandum and sent to him describing my whole experience with American Boy Scouts. I got a letter from him shortly afterwards, and I have read it with great interest. And of course I don't agree with everyone in it, but there's something you had mentioned about a patrol method that has really appealed to me. What should such a patrol leader's handbook contain? So I sat down and wrote an outline and sent it to him, and he called me back in the office and said, "Will you be interested in writing it?" I said, "Well, yeah, I sure would, but you have to write it in a foreign language, so because Danish is my normal language." And then he said, "For every person in this world who has an idea, you can get somebody else to put it in final shape, so why don't you try?" And I wrote it, and it was exactly the vocabulary of a 13, 14-year-old American schoolboy. So it was hardly changed in editing, and he finally came out and sold 2 million copies, so I was well on my start.
The success of the Handbook for Patrol Leaders and the economic conditions in the world once again provided a serendipitous opportunity for Hillcourt and led to his moniker and trademark, Green Bar Bill.
After I wrote this Patrol Leaders Handbook, then the depression was setting in. We were getting deeper and deeper into trouble. And there were more and more magazines disappearing because the magazine lives on its advertising. And we had several boys' magazines. We had St. Nicholas, we had the Open Road for Boys, we had the American Boy and Youth Companion and so on, and all of them disappeared one after the other. And James E. West, the Chief Scout Executive, decided that he had established the boy's life, and by golly, he wasn't going to have that disappear. And the only way we could save the day was to make an application to the Rockefeller Foundation to get a loan of $100,000. And the people from the Lawrence Speller Rockefeller Foundation came in and checked us up and checked the contents of some of the copies and came to the conclusion that they couldn't really see why they should help particularly, because there wasn't anything different in the Boy Scout book than there was in the others. But they gave us a hint. If you put more scouting and if you put more camping and outdoor living and patriotism and physical fitness in it, maybe we'll be interested. So I was called into the office of the Chief Scout Executive and said, come up with some ideas. And then I was thinking in terms of the patrol leader, a page of hint for the patrol leader. But I didn't want to use my regular name. I wanted to create a mysterious person who could give the hint. One of the person that the patrol leader could look up to, sort of a senior patrol leader. And in order to pick a name, I just took the two green bars of the patrol leader's pets in those days and added my Bill, and I became Green Bar Bill October 1932. At the same time, James E. West made me assistant editor of Boys Life magazine in the same issue. So I suddenly was promoted over the heads of quite a few other members of the Boys Life staff, and that has been one of my problems over the years, that a Chief Scout has seen my special abilities and has jumped me a little too fast in many different directions. So,
Firmly established as Green Bar Bill and as an expert on the patrol method, Hillcourt became the scoutmaster of a troop where he could follow in the example of Baden-Powell and Brown Sea Island, testing out his ideas on actual scouts in a functioning troop. This troop of scouts allowed Hillcourt to take a new direction as he wrote the third edition of the Handbook for Scoutmasters and the first edition of the Field Book.
Well, that meant that I was at the regular editorial meetings, and eventually the time came soon afterwards, about 1936, that the Life magazine made its appearance. And that was a brand new kind of a magazine, because everything was done by photographs and captions. There were not too much regular writing in it. And I determined that you could help boys to become good scouts by giving them the different skills in step-by-step photographs with captions. And they fell for that, and they managed to get me a Leica camera, and in the meantime I've been moved out to the ship Scout Reservation, where they established a studio for me and the dark room and so on, so I had all of the equipment. And all that, the next step that happened was that I was given the job of writing the Handbook for Scoutmasters. And so the two things fitted together for me to create a troop in the village of Mendham, New Jersey. And that eventually became the most photographed scout troop in the world, because they posed for hundreds of these photographic features that eventually gave me all of the photographs I needed for another complete Boy Scout handbook, illustrated completely the whole way through with photographs. Now that came out in 1944, the Scout Field Book.
Prior to the first edition of the Field Book, the BSA produced pamphlets called the Scouts Field Book or Scoutmasters Field Book as far back as 1920. The How Book of Scouting was also a forerunner of the Field Book and was produced from 1927 to 1942. Hillcourt shared author credit with James E. West, who by that time had retired as Chief Scout Executive and held the title of Chief Scout. Each of the chapters were called powwows. The cover art was by BSA art director Don Ross. The first edition is filled with photographs taken and processed by Hillcourt of the Scouts in his Mendenhall troop. The third edition of the Handbook for Scoutmasters was the only 2-volume Scoutmaster resource until 2015. Interesting, volumes 1 and 2 were never printed at the same time. In fact, there were only 11 printings of volume 2 ever done, while there were 13 printings of volume 1 during that same time frame. Chapters in the third edition were called chats, and in a section called Presentation Note at the front of each volume, primary author credit is given to William Hillcourt, while noting that such a book results from the efforts of very many. There are so many more stories yet to be revealed from Greenbar Bill's oral history recordings, and we'll visit another segment very soon. But that's all the time we have for now. Join us next week as we continue to learn more about the history of Scouting America through the collection of the National Scouting Museum and Artifact of the Week.